Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. So we are very honored to welcome all of you again this week for our weekly conversations on devotee care called Vaishnav Seva. We had the good fortune of having conversations with His Holiness Jayapatak Swami Maharaj, His Holiness Radhanath Swami Maharaj, His Holiness Devamrit Swami Maharaj, His Holiness Giriraj Swami Maharaj. This week, we are very honored to have with us His Holiness Niranjan Swami Maharaj, who is the GBC for Boston and also the Ukraine. And he has been instrumental in establishing an amazing devotee care program in the Ukraine Yatra. And today, we have the opportunity to hear some of the principles and the practices which he has implemented in Ukraine. So thank you, Maharaj, for joining us this evening. And I would begin by asking you the question that, how did your journey begin in Ukraine, and what brought you to Ukraine in the first place, and how did this entire yatra begin? If you could just share some of those initial, moments of the journey to set the context.
Okay, well, I'll try to make it as short as possible because it was a significant journey into the former Soviet Union, which began in the late 1980s. And I was invited to go there by the then GBC Kirtiraj Prabhu, who was looking for other visitors who could enter into the former Soviet Union. At that time, there were not many devotees who were able to go and travel in the former Soviet Union. My first visit was sponsored by a congregational member who had met the Soviet devotees in India in their first visit to India. And he became very intrigued by their association. And he was asking me how he could visit the devotees in the Soviet Union. So I said, well, I can consult if you'd like to go and visit and see if there's a way for you to go. And I contacted Kirtiraj, but then this person, his name is Charlie. This person said, no, I would only go if you go with me. So that's how it all started. I spoke to Kirtiraj and he arranged my first visit. And it was that time I was on a tour with a tour group. And I was visiting Moscow, Kiev, and Leningrad for a 1-week-long tour. And during those early Soviet times, you had to be on a tour. It was the only way you could get into the Soviet Union as a tourist, to be with a tour guide. And it was understood, and I was cautioned that I was being watched, because most tour guides at that time were agents meant to watch the tourists. And therefore, I was given various types of protocols that I should follow for my first visit and for my subsequent visits. And then, of course, regularly on my subsequent visits, I would visit Ukraine, mostly Kiev, also another city in the southern part, Odessa. And our programs were primarily in flats, in people's homes. They're small, very small flats, which would be chock full of people and shoulder to shoulder. And one of the most interesting experiences that I had in those early Soviet times was that there was a very, very, very intense eagerness from those who were attending those programs. They wanted to hear, and they were ready to sit for hours and hours and hours to hear. And my initial reaction to those first visits is that one thing that the Soviet culture, regime did was they actually made a very fertile place for people who were eager to hear about Krishna. And as I oftentimes said in those early visits, and many subsequent visits as well, that I felt that the sincerity to hear was so strong, and the topic which the people wanted to hear about, specifically Krishna and Krishna consciousness and association with devotees, was so intense that Krishna was reciprocating with their desire, and somehow he was reciprocating with them, and I was getting caught in the crossfire. And I really didn't expect to see such an intense enthusiasm for hearing about Krishna consciousness as I experienced in those early days. But it gave me the realization that really that I was just a witness. I was an observer. And usually if people always, many times people will refer to my early visits in the Soviet Union during those times as putting myself in the position of a pioneer and taking risks. But actually, I didn't do much. I was just giving a wonderful opportunity to observe the potency of Srila Prabhupada's books and the intensity and eagerness people had to hear more that was coming from his books. And as much as possible, I tried to preserve that because I felt that was the best way I could serve the yatra. And therefore, for many years, uh, um, that was the main focus, certainly for the yatra, was Srila Prabhupada's books and the distribution of Srila Prabhupada's books. There's more I could say, but there are a lot of details from those early days. Many times people have said that I should write a book. Maybe someday I will, but I believe there's a lot of people before me who should be given credit for the work that they had done prior to my early visits. Kirti Raj Prabhu is an unsung hero, and certainly Harikesh Prabhu certainly did so much in the area of seeing that so many of Srila Prabhupada's books were profusely distributed in the former Soviet Union. Gopal Krishna Maharaj was very instrumental. His visits to the book fair in Moscow. Prabhu Vishnu Prabhu, he also went there. They all went there prior to me. I was just following on their heels. And I really don't consider myself to be a pioneer of the preaching in the Soviet Union. I consider myself more as just simply the servant. And I've been given a wonderful opportunity to see and observe the growth and expansion of Krishna consciousness based on Srila Prabhupada's very sincere desire for Krishna consciousness to be spread in that part of the world. And if I can somehow serve that mission and serve the devotees who have a strong desire to be a part of that mission, that's the best contribution I could make and can continue to make. So whatever answers I may give tonight will be from that perspective. And it's really not something that I've done. And I feel that it's something that naturally evolved by the enthusiasm and generated in the hearts of those who heard Srila Prabhupada's pure message.
Thank you so much, Maharaj. That was really touching for you to share these wonderful moments of the beginning of the journey. And my next question is just to set the context for all the viewers who are watching across the whole world. Many of them may not be familiar with the exact details of the degree of growth which Mahaprabhu's Sankirtan movement has had in the former Soviet Union. So just to create a context, would you be able to share with the devotees in the former Soviet Union how many, temples or centers maybe approximately there, how many devotees may be around, and then specifically within the Ukraine Yatra, how many centers and how many devotees are currently practicing, just to give a context.
I don't really believe I have the statistics. I can't speak so much for Russia because I'm not as active in Russia as I am in Ukraine, although in the early days, I was visiting approximately 70 cities a year, including cities from Ukraine, Russia, Lithuania, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Moldova, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. So I was quite active in traveling in those very early days, but in the course of time, tried to become a little bit more focused, especially between Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus, and to some degree in the Baltic countries. But I know there's so many temples. I can't say exactly how many temples there are in Ukraine. I'd say devotees who are practicing Krishna consciousness. The last figure that was given to me was there are 15,000 devotees in Ukraine. And that could very easily be accepted because even our last festivals that we were having in southern Ukraine prior to the conflict, which began in 2014, the last festival we had there were 12,000 devotees attending that festival. So it's very easy, and that was 2014. It's very easy to conceive that at least there are 15,000 devotees in Ukraine. I'd say there's well over 100,000 devotees, but I don't know the statistics throughout throughout the whole former Soviet Union. Um, I would say even more. I'm saying practicing devotees, chanting rounds, following the principles. As far as those who ascribe to Krishna consciousness philosophy, hundreds of thousands. I can't say for sure. As far as temples are concerned, I know that we have approximately in Ukraine about 25 temples, but we have gatherings in smaller temples, Namharta programs, and the gatherings in 100 cities in Ukraine alone. So that gives a little bit of an insight. I'm sure in Russia there are many similar statistics for Russia, only it would be much more because of the size of Russia, the population of Russia. And in Belarus, I know there are at least 500 to 1,000 practicing devotees. In the Baltic countries, I would say similar figure as the number of practicing devotees.
Thank you so much, Maharaj. That really was an amazing explanation of the number of devotees practicing. It's mind-boggling to hear that figure. So you began, you know, the Krishna consciousness movement in Ukraine primarily through book distribution, Sankirtan, and that is basically you're giving out books and encouraging people to connect with Krishna consciousness. So after having been in Sankirtan for so many years, what was the particular point in your journey where you started contemplating deeper about devotee care, and how did that transition happen? Was it like abrupt, or you were thinking about it, or it was just one thing flowed into another? Because there are many leaders currently watching this show from across the whole world and who will also see this episode later, and many ISKCON temple leaders are many times asking us this question, that how does implementation of devotee care help in growing our temple and making our temple strong? So you know I would like to hear from you.
Well, it's not something that happened overnight. That's definitely, I can testify. It took years and years and years to uh, somehow instill in the minds of the devotees that devotee care had to be given a greater priority. Uh, and what really, for me, the catalyst that I experienced, not only in the former Soviet Union, but in other places as well, one of the experiences that I would commonly have is I would ask the leadership about certain devotees who I had seen visiting the temple regularly and for a long time. And when I would ask the question, where are they? Uh, common response is, oh, we haven't seen him for a long time. And I said, oh, do you know why you haven't seen him for a long time? And no, because we haven't seen him. And that kind of a response in of itself did a lot to me to help me to realize that there were many devotees who gave a lot in the early years, the formative years of Krishna consciousness, and who sacrificed a lot, and to not know why they were not being seen because they weren't coming wasn't, for me, it wasn't the right answer. And I felt I had to get deeper into that, addressing that concern. And it was at that time also, it was my early years in visiting the former Soviet Union. I had the opportunity to visit, and I've written about this in the introduction to my book, Taking Care of Krishna's Devotees. Another catalyst for me was my visit to the Chowpatty Temple in, I believe it was in 1993. And therefore, that visit in of itself really kind of instilled with me that there was a need. I saw it. I heard about a system of counseling. I heard about devotees taking responsibility for younger devotees. I saw the fruit of a very happy yatra where the brahmacharis and the householders seemed to be of very, very cooperative, having very congenial relationships. And I felt that this is kind of the mood that should be somehow shared. And therefore, I inquired deeper into it myself, observed it through my visits, and then gradually I wanted to try to replicate, excuse me, that in the former Soviet Union. What I really found that the best opportunity to replicate it and for it to really take root is when the leaders were of the same mindset. And I would say, at least my experience, one of the ways that devotee care, and I don't want to use the word system devotee care, and I'll address that in the future, because when I use the word system, then sometimes people have this idea that it's a system. And if we have a system to care for devotees, then the system will take care of devotees. But that's like having a very, very strong shell that's hollow inside. You may have a very strong shell, but the real substance is what's inside the shell, and not just the shell. So therefore, I'm very, very careful to not use the word devotee care system, because I feel that the fundamental essence of devotee care is to care for devotees. And I believe that when devotees feel cared for, then it naturally filters down. The same experience will filter down. And I felt that, at least my experience in Ukraine, it resonated in the minds and in the hearts of many of the devotee leaders there. I believe one of the successes for Ukraine, and I'm not saying this doesn't take place elsewhere, but because I've given more focus to Ukraine, I'm speaking about Ukraine. But therefore, one of the successes of Ukraine is I found that in the leadership, and there, that we were both on the same page. Let's put it that way. And because we were both on the same page, and because we felt the need to give a focus on devotee care, and because that's always been our point of focus, then that kind of relationship between myself and the leadership has really given a lot of nourishment to the devotee care in Ukraine. But the obstacles in the beginning were great. And one of the greatest misconceptions that I felt that I had to break in the minds of many of the leaders, especially those who took a lot of managerial responsibility, one of the greatest misconceptions is that the devotee care was a department. And because it was a department, it had a department head, and it was the responsibility of the department head to take care of devotees. And it's their thing. I have my thing. I have my responsibilities to do. I have so many managerial responsibilities, managerial headaches I have to deal with, so many other pressing responsibilities that I just need to let the devotee care department take it up. And that was a major obstacle. That was one obstacle. And another obstacle that I found is that in the minds of many of the devotees who were being appealed to take responsibility for devotee care, they somehow thought that Niranjana Swami is pushing this because he needs a system to take care of his disciples, which nothing could be further from the truth. There's so many devotees in Ukraine who are not my disciples, and they should also feel cared for too. Why is it something? And this misconception was there, and it took years to break it. That the devotee care system was Niranjana Swami's thing to take care of his disciples, and that really needed to be broken. And it took a lot of work to break that misconception and to establish that no, that this is not my thing to take care of my disciples. Why are just my disciples persons who should be given attention? Srila Prabhupada had a much greater vision than that for the future of his society, and that's why he asked responsible leaders to take responsibility for the devotees under their care and to care for them and to nourish them, to protect them. And just like I oftentimes use the example that Bhakti Thakur uses the example in one of his books. Somehow the title of the book is not there. Why, I don't know. But he uses the example that Shraddha, or faith, is like the birth of a newborn baby. And when a faith, or when a newborn baby takes its birth, then the parents, especially the mother, are always very careful to protect the newborn baby from dangerous creatures. Mother's always very careful to nourish the child and protect from dangerous elements such as heat and cold, hunger and thirst, and to give nourishment to the child so the child can grow healthy and become strong enough to be able to personally deal with these external distractions that could harm the good health of the baby. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur uses that example to illustrate how Shraddha is like the birth of a newborn baby. And when Shraddha takes birth in the heart of a living entity, and Shraddha, he explains, means Shraddha in Bhakti, or pure devotional service, when it actually appears in the heart by association with the devotees, then that faith needs to be nourished. It needs to be protected from karma and gyan, and it has to be protected from other dangerous creatures. And therefore, it's the responsibility of the leaders to nourish and to protect all the devotees under their care. And that became the forefront. That became I believe, one of the foremost principles in devotee care is faith. And of course, there are many other activities that are required to protect faith. There's not just preaching, and not just and preaching to devotees and correcting devotees and training devotees, but another very important element for promoting faith is to be a good example. And as you said, and in your question, you asked that actually Lord Chaitanya, he and yes, I did Sankirtan for many years. In the beginning, we distributed so many books throughout the former Soviet Union, and we encouraged so many devotees to go out and to distribute his books and to perform Sankirtan. But Lord Chaitanya himself, who said, Yuga Dhamma Pravataimu Nama Sankirtam Chari Bhava Bhakti Diya Nachimu Bhavan, said, I've come to awaken this ecstatic love for Krishna through the Sankirtan movement, and to teach others how to actually do it. I'll come myself and practice it myself, and to teach by my own example. So Lord Chaitanya, he came to disseminate the Sankirtan movement and to teach by his own example. So I felt, and I made the connection between the Sankirtan, that we were performing and distributing so many books and encouraging so many people to come and to take part in our kirtans and to take part in the activities of the temple, that one of the most important principles is that we had to show an example. That's what Lord Chaitanya taught. He came to teach it himself, to show an example. So we had to show an example of devotees who were nourished and who were sheltered by the faith they have in their leaders, sheltered by the example that they found in their leaders, and sheltered by the philosophy they heard from their leaders, and sheltered by the example they saw of how the devotees associate with each other. And that example is devotee care. That example is very powerful. Lord Chaitanya came to teach devotee care by his example. So that is the essence of devotee care, and there were certainly many obstacles that had to be confronted to teach that example and to help others who come in the association of devotees to aspire to come to that same level of faith. And I would say that's the beginnings of our devotee care system. Forgive me, I use the word system. That was the beginning of our devotee care. In the places where I tried to begin it in the former Soviet Union, but it really took root, I believe, in Ukraine, because the priority and the leadership, they took it as their responsibility to see that it's not just a department that somebody else is responsible to take care of. It became pervasive, and in all areas of our preaching in Ukraine, and in everything, in all departments. And it's still a struggle. There's still resistance, but there's still hope. It's an ongoing process.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maharaj, for sharing that beautiful insight about Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and how his Sankirtan, his sharing of the philosophy, and the association between devotees described in the Chaitanya Leela, they basically are the foundation principles for our devotee care. And very interesting to hear that your journey also towards this devotee care implementation has been an ongoing realization, especially after seeing committed devotees, going away from the association and not so active. And so therefore my next question would be that after having experienced several decades of implementation of devotee care, experience of the devotees which you have seen with devotee care, what are the top three principles of devotee care you feel which have really worked for the devotees here in Ukraine, in your experience, with respect to devotee care?
Well, I've already alluded to them to some degree. I would say that one of the top principles is having trusting relationships with the local leadership. One of the things that I've felt that evolved over my years of responsibility in Ukraine, in Moldova, is I felt that I had to care for the devotees. I had to distance myself from management to some degree, because I believe that one of the stifling elements that stifles devotee care is micromanagement and disempowerment. And it plays out in many aspects of our leadership and responsibilities we have as leaders of the society. So I've always felt that, especially in this area of my preaching, that the local leaders, they know the laws better than I do. They know the language better than I do. They know the culture better than I do. They know the psychology better than I do. Why not let them lead? And why not I take some responsibility to encourage them and to help them focus on devotee care? At the same time, take responsibilities for the management locally. I believe that kind of relationship, that's been a trusting relationship for over 3 decades, has contributed to the devotee care in Ukraine. And as I said, I believe that the leadership has to also be very careful to not micromanage and empower the devotees, and that, because that's also can be a stifling effect. And I believe that that devotee care has to be properly understood by those who are distributing or caring for others. And in fact, recently, just last year, I gave a talk about care, not control. And because sometimes one of the problems that arises sometimes, that devotees began to take a position of caring, but their position of caring was too much trying to control the individuality and the especially persons who are coming forward. They wanted to become a part of the community. They wanted to become initiated devotees, and it became part of a system to control them, that if they wanted to move forward, then they had to submit to their care. And I believe that submit to my care is a very contradictory principle to apply, that it has to be earned. And although submission is certainly something that is required for spiritual growth, faith is something that can never be legislated. And therefore, it's the responsibility of the devotees to exemplify in their own leadership roles the quality of a person who's capable of caring. So that is also one of the obstacles that needed to be overcome. And one of the, I would say, one of the elements that made it conducive by trying to convince the devotees that care should be first and foremost and not control. And I believe because that was introduced in the very beginning as a very, very important principle, and it evolved even more so over time, that has also contributed in a very positive way to the growth of the devotee care in Ukraine.
Maharaj, thank you for sharing that amazing insight on trustworthy relationships with the leadership. And I think that kind of a synergy which you have managed between the GBC level and the management level connection, I think that's really very, very important and very inspiring to see that it has been a sustainable relationship for last 3 decades. That's extremely inspiring to hear. My next question is revolved around the fact that nothing drives home a point better than case studies or some examples. So would you like to share some stories of devotee care from Ukraine which you feel may really strike a chord with the devotees?
There are a lot of stories. I mean, one significant story that immediately comes to mind is the conflict that took place in Ukraine in 2014. Don't want to go into too much details of the conflict. I want to try to avoid any political innuendos whatsoever as the causes of the conflict. I will simply define it as a conflict. And it certainly was a conflict, and it certainly did endanger the lives of many devotees. And because of the conflict, many devotees, hundreds of families, were forced to flee their homes, and many of them were forced to flee with nothing except maybe their passports and as much as they can carry on their back. And because the conflict went for quite some time, in fact, it's still not even completely over, but it was really going on quite substantially. A number of deaths were taking place. The devotees realized that they had to uproot themselves and to plant themselves in places outside where they had lived for many years of their lives with their family, and that they had nothing to start with. So I believe many of the leaders in our movement will remember that I tried to create awareness of what was going on at that time, and I thank all the devotees, so many of the devotees throughout the world. I mean, I'm overwhelmed. I was personally overwhelmed by the response, and I tried to give regular reports and updates about what was happening with their donations. But at one point, I wasn't able to do it because of something that was happening with the internal information and how it was potentially could have been used against the devotees. So I had to stop distributing that information. But nonetheless, those donations were used to help, and we had a whole internal system in Ukraine for funding devotees both in Ukraine who had to move to other places in Ukraine, and funding devotees who had to move outside Ukraine to other areas, and giving them some seed Lakshmi to start their lives over again. And I remember many devotees who had somehow become alienated somehow from the association of devotees. They were writing letters of gratitude saying that this in of itself, seeing the care that was there for the devotees who were undergoing such difficulties at that time, rekindled their faith in devotee association. And they, based on that observation, although it didn't really as much happen to them, but just they simply observed it, they came back into the association of devotees. That's one example of care, and it was certainly not something that was done exclusively by the Ukrainian leadership, but because the Ukrainian leadership could have never done it without the support globally of so many devotees. But the Ukrainian leadership definitely did mobilize the devotees and created an internal system to reach out and to find the names, the places, the contact of anybody who was adversely affected by that event, and to help them get on their feet. So that was one devotee care experience I could speak of. Also, another experience is many of those devotees were isolated, and therefore there was a devotee care outreach program to bring those devotees who had been isolated throughout those years into the association of devotees by facilitating their participation into our annual festivals, so that they could get the association with leaders who were coming and preachers who were coming from all over the world for our Bhakti Sangam festivals. And by facilitating that really, many devotees spoke from the heart of gratitude, and telling how much it nourished their faith to be able to be back in the association of so many devotees in big kirtans. At that point, there were thousands and thousands of devotees who were able to participate in kirtans. And that was another effort that was taken upon by the leadership in Ukraine. Another one is the devotee care is in Kiev. It's primarily, but in other temples as well, they have, over the years, they have created a Bhaktivedanta fund. And that Bhaktivedanta fund has been created and managed solely by the community. It's a community fund from the community for the community. And it's in many instances of devotees in the community who've had to face difficulties. One devotee's house burnt down, was not livable. The roof wasn't even existing, and it was the beginning of the winter. And many of the devotees got together and helped that devotee and the family to relocate and to provide their necessities. This is only one example. Many devotees had severe health problems. The community came forward and helped. And I make this point again and again to devotees that the best way to feel connected is through community. Sometimes there's there's a tendency to think the temple has a responsibility to help us, but the temple has a responsibility to encourage community. And therefore, that has been another emphasis of the devotee care, is encouraging community, not just in the temple, but outside the temple. And then as that community grows, that community takes care of the members of their communities in various ways, which have required, at times of great need, help and support from the members of their community. So that's very, very palpable. It happens. And I would say that I could give, a list, many accounts of how that happened, from car accidents to death in the family, devotees killed in car accidents. All of these situations, as much as possible, were met with community support. And that's a very positive outcome of devotee care.
Me?
Are you still there?
Yes, Maharaj. Thank you so much for sharing those details, because I'm not very sure whether devotees across the world know to such an extent the way you have described. And maybe at some point you should maybe publish something with some of these details, so that the awareness about these initiatives become more well known. So thank you very much for sharing this and showing such an amazing, sterling example of implementation.
Just one response. These
Yeah.
are not my initiatives. These are the initiatives of the devotees themselves, who actually learned the importance of caring.
Sure, definitely, agree. But you are our instrument to thank all of them. So we are just expressing our gratitude to you. So I've heard you speak from Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's Bhakti Aloka on a specific theme which is related to Prajalpa. And I found it quite fascinating in the previous conversations about how you say that one of the greatest needs for devotee care to prosper and progress in ISKCON would be how we are able to maintain confidentiality. So, could you share this fascinating connection between confidentiality and care, and how lack of confidentiality translates into, very little opportunity and scope for care?
Yes, I've actually spoken at length on this topic, and but I'll try to be as concise as possible. Yes, in Sri Bhakti Loka, but Bhaktivinoda Thakur, uh, he has a particular topic he speaks about in two sections of Sri Bhakti Loka under the title of Controlling the Urge to Speak. And he's given various evidences from Scripture of the importance of understanding when to speak about others and when not to speak about others. And he uses evidence from Shastra. And he explains that, in principle, devotees should not speak about others unnecessarily. And he says, those who speak about others, then if he speaks about others and cannot control that urge to speak, then enmity is created as a result. So I believe it's very important for leadership to understand the guidelines of when to speak about others and when not to speak about others. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur in Sri Bhakti Aloka, he gives different examples of how our previous acharyas would speak about others, but in a very controlled way. He said sometimes a spiritual leader or spiritual master, when he's instructing his disciples, he has to speak about others in a general way, because he has to teach his dependents not only what to do, but what to be careful about not doing. And he uses Shukadev Goswami as an example. Then Shukadev Goswami speaks in a general way about householders who simply live to maintain themselves, work during the day, and have sex life at night. And he describes them as fallible soldiers. So he uses that as an example where Shukadev Goswami was speaking in a general way about others. And sometimes it's necessary to speak about others in a general way like that. If I go into all the details of the reasons for speaking, I might not have sufficient time. But the important point to understand is that to control the urge to speak, one should be conscious, and Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, if one speaks about others with any enmity or envy or malice within his heart, then he's an offender of Bhakti Devi, and his mind can never be controlled. So, therefore, understanding this point, devotees should be conscientious about avoiding prajalpa, because generally prajalpa means to speak about others, and to speak about others is very natural. It's the natural nature of the soul to speak about others. The gopis are always talking about Krishna, and the cowherd boys are speaking about Krishna, and speaking about others is the natural function of the tongue. But when it's perverted, then the tendency is to speak about others when we get in the association of devotees, and therefore Lord Chaitanya cautioned Raghunath Das Goswami to not be very careful about this Gramya Katha, to speak about others. And the result of this Gramya Katha is that When such Brahmikata is so pervasive, and when devotees don't learn how to control the urge to speak, that devotees don't feel they can open up and reveal their mind in confidence, which is one of the principles that our Acharya Srila Rupa Goswami has given for loving exchanges. Two of the principles: to inquire confidentially and to reveal our mind in confidence. But if Brahmikata is so pervasive, and if people don't know how to control the urge to speak about others, then who's going to want to speak and reveal their mind in confidence? Especially if by so doing, they have to live in constant fear that if I say something in confidence to somebody, and I oftentimes use this example, I may find it on Facebook the next day. So this is not devotee care. And I'm sure there are advocates of, and there will be many people who will challenge what I just said and say, but the truth must be spoken. And Prabhupada says we have to speak the truth, and we shouldn't withdraw from speaking the truth. But yes, we have to look at it in a balanced way, and we have to look at it in a way that is most conducive for creating an atmosphere of confidentiality, because I believe that kind of confidentiality, as set in stone by Srila Rupa Goswami, if we ever want love in our society, we have to follow these guidelines, which is to give prasadam and accept prasadam, to reveal our mind in confidence, to inquire confidentially, and to give gifts to others and to accept gifts. This is the foundation of loving exchanges between devotees. And without loving exchanges, then we go back to our previous point. What do we have to show to those who are attracting to the Krishna consciousness movement? Where's the example if we have no loving exchanges? So this is why confidentiality, I believe, is a very important principle that our leaders need to learn, when to speak about others and when not to speak about others. And there are many principles I've tried to teach the leadership in this connection, even when they have their meetings. And sometimes when they have their meetings, they have to speak about others. Well, they should speak about others in the presence of others, not behind their back, because then they'll just lose trust. That if they think, oh, the leaders are getting together just simply to speak about others, then that doesn't breed trust. So these principles can be applied by the leadership and amongst the leaders themselves, of the importance of confidentiality in a way to help the devotees under their care.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Maharaj. That was really very deep and touching. And I think what you just quoted, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in context of how we should be applying these principles, is so very important for taking devotee care to the next level within our society. So I would like to now request you to speak something about the festival which you have been organizing for many years, and how is this festival connected to the principle of devotee care, and what has been your experience. And there is a short video which we would like to share with others, but you could share a few words to preface that as we go into the video.
Okay. Well, I'll just say a few words because I believe our time is very limited and it's a 5-minute video. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's fine. You go ahead, Maharaj.
Excuse me?
You can go a little over time. It's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, I would say that the way our Bhakti Sangam festival evolved into what it is today is the catalyst happened one day to me when there was a devotee from North America who was attending our festival. She came up to me early one morning, and she was saying to me that I forgot my card, and because I didn't have my card, they didn't let me into Mangalarti. And I started to this was a catalyst. I mean, this really said, wait a minute, because somebody didn't have their card, and apparently maybe they didn't pay, which was not a fact. They just forgot their card, and they had to go all the way back to get it. That they couldn't attend Mangalarti, something's wrong. Something's fundamentally wrong. So I decided to meet with the leaders, and I simply planted some seeds of we have to somehow try to create an atmosphere in our festivals where it's not based on any kind of commercial exchange between those who are attending and those who are organizing. And we should try to create a festival which is voluntary and where the no Lakshmi coming in inures to the benefit of any individual, inures to the benefit of any temple. Any donation which is given for the festival is specifically for the festival, and that's it. And if we try to create an atmosphere of a festival which is organized on this basis, in the beginning, it may take time to breed trust. In the beginning, people won't catch the concept. But if we do it, and if we're consistent, and then we try to be consistent with that, and we have faith, we'll see that we'll find ourselves, and as what actually happened, that the festival is growing to be participated by at one point before the conflict, there was 12,000 devotees were attending, and there were no festival fees imposed. There were no prasadam fees imposed, and the only fees that those who took part in the festival were those who actually, whatever accommodations they wanted, the festival organization simply acted as a go-between to facilitate them to get their facilities from the different resorts who had opened up their rooms for the devotees to stay. And that's how it started. The Bhakti Sangam festival started, I can't remember what year we started to do that, but its growth, it increased more and more as a very voluntary basis. The team of volunteers, they go there every year. They set up the pandal, which is as big as an airplane hangar. They give 1 week to fully dedicate themselves to set up the pandal, to set up the kitchens, and when in cooking, different yatras take responsible for each day, and for taking responsibility for getting the boga, for cooking the boga, and for distributing the boga, for cleaning up, distributing the prasadam, and for cleaning up after the prasadam. And the next day, another yatra does it. And each day, a different yatra or groups of yatras do it. And it's all strictly voluntary. One story I like to tell in this connection, it's been told many times, but it's one of my favorite stories. And so I remember one day going into the pot washing area of the festival, and we used to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of buckets that was required for the serve out of the prasadam. And I went into the pot washing area. It was at the end of the day, and there was one devotee left, and the whole room was just filled with barrels, buckets, spoons, every kind of utensil you required for serving out prasadam. And the devotee who was there, apparently he was the last one finishing up the last of the work, and he had been there all day. And I said to the devotee, is there anything that you need, or is there any problems that you have with the service that you had of taking this responsibility today? And he turned at me with a real sour face, and he said, yes. He says, I have a problem. And I said, what is it? And he said to me, they're only going to let me do this one day. And that was the mood. That was the mood. He was disturbed because he was so much enthused and enlivened by the opportunity to serve that he didn't want to be restricted to one day, and he wanted to do it more. So that's the kind of spirit that kind of was created, and the festival has gone on in that way. And there's a short video which is going to be shown about the registration of the festival, which is done on the same basis, with it shows one devotee speaks about his experience of organizing the registration. The registration is voluntary. Registration is required, even though there's no mandatory fees, because the cooks need to know how many people to cook for, and therefore everybody needs to register. Some people can't afford to pay the fees, and they're given a calendar, they're given a suite, they're encouraged and told where to go for accommodations, even if they can only give 10 grivna, which is about 30 cents. And there are many people who can only do that. But nonetheless, somehow, always it seems that there's enough that comes in to cover the cost of the festival. And sometimes there's even something at the end of the festival to help seed the festival for the following year. So the video we're going to show is the registration part of the festival, and a devotee, and shows the sweets that are given out, the organization that is there for registration, the volunteer workers who take part in the registration of the festival, and also, as we said, a commentary by one of the devotees who organizes the registration of the festival. I believe it's about a 5-minute video. It's in Russian, but I had it subtitled, so you can read it.
Yes, Maharaj. So, Sakshi Gopal Prabhu, we can have that now.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Kristaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namale.
У нашего департамента есть миссия, и эта миссия заключается в том, чтобы создать благоприятные условия для встречи гостей, для регистрации гостей и вдохновить преданных на добровольное пожертвование. Уникальность служения в том, что преданные, которые занимаются служением на регистрации, это те преданные, которых гости фестиваля видят первыми. На регистрации есть возможность послужить 1000 преданным, встретить всех, развить отношения, как внутри коллектива, так и познакомиться с новыми преданными, которые приехали к нам на фестиваль. гость, он представитель Господа, и к нему нужно относиться с почтением, с благоговением. Преданные, которые занимаются служением в департаменте регистрации, должны быть жизнерадостными. Они являются лицом фестиваля. Они должны понимать, в чем заключается суть фестиваля, и донести это до сердец тех преданных, которые приехали на фестиваль Бхакти Сангам.
Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaurabhakta.
По окончанию фестиваля мы уже ощущаем разлуку. Еще фестиваль, как правило, еще когда фестиваль не заканчивается, уже у нас разлука о том, что придет время, нам придется расставаться. И не хочется, чтобы разлука состоялась. И мы оставляем в своем сердце память о этих замечательных преданных, эти лица счастливые, воспевающие святые имена. И вот эта наполненность дивными чувствами, она остается на весь год. И мы ожидаем вновь встречи с преданными в следующем году и ждем с нетерпением следующий фестиваль Бхакти Сангам.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna.
Thank you so much, Maharaj, for sharing such amazing insights about devotee care and also sharing with us this wonderful experience of the Bhakti Sangam festival, revealing some of the amazing practical help which devotees have shared with others in difficulty during conflict times and difficult times. I think this has been an extremely inspiring and revealing session for all of us who have got this opportunity to hear from you. We hope and pray that this message which you have shared with us inspires many leaders across the world of ISKCON to embed devotee care more thoroughly as part of their culture within their communities, and the culture of devotee care spreads more and more within ISKCON. I would like to end by also sharing that next week on 29th, Wednesday evening, 7:30, we would have the fortune of hosting His Holiness Gopal Krishna Goswami Maharaj, and we would be sharing with him conversation on specifically spiritual care, sadhana, and Srila Prabhupada's books. And Wednesday, 29th of July, 7:30 p.m., that would be our next speaker. And also we are very happy to share with you that after launching our first website, after the devotee care website, we launched another one specifically for the courses across ISKCON, which was known as the ISKCONcourses.com. Today, we are very happy to launch another very important resource, which will be of great use to the leaders across ISKCON, because part of our implementation of devotee care in the 12 areas, one of the areas is caring for leaders. And so many times leaders struggle with the lack of resources and support. And therefore, we are happy to launch www.organizeyourtemple.com. Maybe at some point Sakshi Gopal Prabhu will show. Yeah, so this is the URL, www.organizeyourtemple.com. It is NISE, not NIZE. And if you visit, you'll find first of all the homepage, and then there is a tab on the courses. So if you click on the courses, this basically takes you to the link of the ISKCONcourses.com, and all the various courses which are available within ISKCON, they are shown in that. When we come back, we'll again see that there are all these different courses which we have already launched. So in the second part of the course, if you see, is the leadership development. So that is still not developed. We are in the process of creating online resources for that. Then the second tab is the knowledge exchange. So basically, within knowledge exchange, ISKCON leaders and temples across the world could access various good practices which different ISKCON temples have been doing. And then there is leadership experiences of Prabhupada's disciples and various senior leaders who have shared their experiences of leadership. And we also have a section called How to Organize Handbooks, where actually each one of the different departments within ISKCON, we have created handbooks for managers and leaders to refer to as the ready reference. So if you just click on the good practices, so once you click on the good practices, you will see the various areas of leadership within an ISKCON temple. For example, fundraising, congregational development, kitchen religion, temple construction. So for example, if you click on fundraising, then we have interviews with some of the best experts in fundraising in the world of ISKCON. So we have, from Pune, we are from Juhu, the Bhishma department, the mailer list, Kalash Abhishek at Juhu. So various things. For example, if you can click on the ISKCON Juhu Bhishma, the one on the left second. Yeah. So then you will see that we have interviews conducted. Yeah. So basically, the PDF is available here, and there are also interviews on videos, which you can see these videos where we have interviews with Mukund Madhav Prabhu, and he's sharing in detail about some of these. And also, if you do not want to see through the entire video, then there are PDFs attached where the script can be read. So this is just a sample of some of the best practices which we are providing through this knowledge exchange. Go back to the knowledge exchange. Then we'll see. Yeah, go back further. You can go back, yeah, and further back. So then you can click on the leadership experiences there after the next two good practices on top. Yeah. So in leadership experiences, we have interviewed leaders from across the world, especially those who have spent quality time in the movement. They have understood Srila Prabhupada's mood and have been leading. So we have Shivaram Maharaj's interview, Anuttama Prabhu's interview, Badrinarayan Maharaj's interview, Devamrit Maharaj, and various other leaders who have spoken about Srila Prabhupada's vision, Srila Prabhupada's expectations from leadership, and their own experiences in the many years of leading Krishna consciousness. So this series of interviews would also be very useful for the leaders of ISKCON today, because they could learn from the experiences of such senior devotees. So the third element in the knowledge exchange, if you can go up again to the top of the page, yeah, is how to organize handbooks below. Yeah, you can click on that. Yeah, how to organize handbooks. Yeah. So basically, when we have For example, how to organize youth outreach, how to run a Govinda's restaurant, how to organize hospitality. So if you just click on how to run Govinda's restaurant as an example, it's, yeah, so then, you know, you can click on the PDF. You can go back. Yeah, go on the restaurant administration. Yeah, on the left, yeah. Okay, I think there is some problem in this. Go back. Go to the next ISKCON websites. ISKCON websites. Yeah. So if you go to select website category, yeah. So you see the various website categories. For example, if you just go to, you know, restaurants. Yeah, correct. So then all the various websites connected to restaurants in ISKCON, it will show up. This is one way of navigating. Then go back. So if you go on the right hand side, show map, you can click on show map. Yeah. So then if you just, you know, go over India, for example, take the cursor over India. So if you click there, yeah. So then you will find all the websites which are connected to the Indian subcontinent. Depending on the areas, it will show up. Can you click on the India thing?
It's popping up. It pops up in a separate window. I'll try and share that.
Oh, okay, fine. That's fine. That's fine. So basically, this is just some brief idea on, you know, how these resources could help, and if any of the, you know, temples need any kind of support, then we have like a strategic planning network led by Shubhananda Prabhu. Gopal Bhatta Prabhu is overseeing that as part of the GBC strategic planning. Depending on the level of support you need, we could connect you with the strategic planning network. We could connect you with specific resources you need. We could help organize some kind of Zoom calls to give more details about a specific area, department. So, you know, we could help support in any possible way your leadership roles by this. So this is basically www.organizeyourtemple.com, and this we are launching as part of devotee care for leadership for ISKCON leaders across the world. So once again, in conclusion, thank you very much, His Holiness Niranjana Swami Maharaj, for sparing your valuable time this evening with us, sharing your experiences of devotee care. See you all again next week, 7:30, Wednesday 29th, with His Holiness Gopal Krishna Goswami. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.